She thought aging meant accepting less, meant being grateful for whatever scraps of love came her way. He promised her forever, told her age was just a number, made her believe that maybe, finally, she'd found someone who saw her, really saw her, not as a mistake, but as a miracle. Then she met his family, and the nightmare began. They called her manipulative, a gold digger, an embarrassment. They told her she was stealing his future, that her wrinkled hands had no business holding their son's dreams. She endured it all, every insult, every cruel whisper, every family dinner she wasn't invited to, every younger woman they paraded in front of him like she didn't exist. Because she loved him, because he said he'd handle it, because she believed love could win. Until the day his mother called, with an ultimatum that shattered everything. And she discovered the cruelest truth of all. Sometimes the person who promises to fight for you is the first one to surrender. Margaret Sullivan had stopped believing in second chances long before she met Derek Thompson at the Highland Coffee House on Madison Road in the spring of 2023. At 58 years old, she'd learned that life didn't hand out do-overs, especially not to divorced women living alone in a modest rental townhouse in Oakley, one of Cincinnati's quietly aging neighborhoods, where the trees grew thick and the houses settled deeper into their foundations with each passing year. She'd been married once, for 23 years, to a man who'd gradually disappeared into his work, until one day he disappeared entirely, leaving behind divorce papers and a forwarding address in Columbus. That was 7 years ago. Since then, Margaret had built a small, careful life. Her job as an office manager at a dental practice in Hyde Park, her book club that met every other Thursday, her Sunday morning walks along the Little Miami Scenic Trail, and her Tuesday evenings volunteering at the Cincinnati Food Bank. It was a good life, a quiet life, a safe life that asked nothing of her heart. Derek was 39 when they met, a full 19 years younger than Margaret, though she didn't know that immediately. What she knew first was his smile, genuine and unguarded, in a way that made her forget, for just a moment, all the reasons she'd stopped smiling back at men. He'd been sitting at the table next to hers, struggling with a laptop that kept freezing, muttering frustrated curses under his breath, while the April rain drummed against the coffee house windows. "Have you tried forcing a restart?" Margaret had asked, not because she was trying to start a conversation, but because she genuinely couldn't watch someone suffer through easily fixable technology problems. It was a weakness of hers, her ex-husband used to say, always trying to fix things. Derek had looked up, rain-damp hair falling across his forehead, and something in his expression, relief mixed with embarrassment, had made her chest tighten in a way she'd almost forgotten was possible. That was how it started. A simple conversation about frozen screens and corrupted files that somehow turned into 2 hours of talking about everything else. His work as a freelance graphic designer, her love of mystery novels, his recent move back to Cincinnati after a decade in Chicago, her memories of when Oakley was still considered the outskirts of the city. When he asked for her number, Margaret almost said no. Almost reminded herself that men like Derek, handsome, charming, still young enough to have their whole lives ahead of them, didn't actually want women like her. Almost protected herself, but she didn't. 3 months later, on a warm July evening, when the cicadas screamed in the trees and the humidity wrapped around the city like a wet blanket, Derek told her he loved her. They were sitting on her small back patio, drinking iced tea and watching fireflies blink in the overgrown grass that separated her townhouse from the next. "I know this might seem fast," he'd said, reaching across the wrought iron table to take her hand. His palm was warm against hers, solid and real. "But I've never felt this way about anyone. You make me feel seen, like I can be myself without pretending." Margaret had wanted to pull her hand away, wanted to remind him about the 19 years between them, about the grey threading through her auburn hair, about the laugh lines around her eyes, and the way gravity had started winning its inevitable war with her bodies, wanted to protect them both from the impossibility of what he was suggesting. Instead, she'd squeezed his hand and whispered, "I love you too." It was Derek who first mentioned meeting his family, 6 weeks after that July confession. They were driving back from a day trip to Hocking Hills, watching the sun set over the rolling farmland of southern Ohio, when he'd said it casually, almost as an afterthought, "My mum's been asking about you." Margaret's stomach had tightened. "What have you told her?" "That I'm seeing someone amazing. That I'm happy." He'd glanced over at her, his expression open and guileless. "She wants to meet you. My whole family does. Sunday dinner at my parents' place in Mason. It's kind of a tradition. Everyone comes. My sister Rachel and her husband, my brother Connor, my Aunt Linda. It's chaotic but fun. You'll love them. Derek." Margaret had started, but he'd reached over and squeezed her knee. "I want them to know you, Maggie. I want them to see what I see. How smart you are. How kind. How you make me laugh, even when I'm stressed about a deadline. I want to share you with them." She should have heard the warning in his words, the way he spoke as if he needed to convince them, as if her worth required explanation. But all she heard was the sincerity in his voice, the hope. "Okay," she'd agreed, ignoring the knot of anxiety forming in her chest. Sunday dinner. The Thompson family lived in Mason, a sprawling suburb north of Cincinnati, where cookie-cutter subdivisions with names like Willow Creek Estates and Heritage Hills spread across former farmland. Derek's parents' house was a large colonial with black shutters and a professionally landscaped yard, the kind of house that spoke of comfortable middle-class success. His father was a regional manager for a pharmaceutical company. His mother, a retired elementary school teacher. Margaret had dressed carefully that Sunday in September, a simple navy dress that was elegant without trying too hard. Pearl earrings her mother had given her, low heels. She'd studied herself in the mirror before Derek picked her up, searching for flaws, for reasons they might reject her. The grey in her hair seemed more prominent in the harsh bathroom light, the lines around her mouth deeper. "You look beautiful," Derek had said when he'd arrived, kissing her cheek. If he noticed her nervousness, he didn't mention it. The disaster began the moment Derek's mother, Patricia Thompson, opened the front door. Margaret watched the woman's face shift through a series of expressions in the span of 3 seconds. Pleasant expectation, confusion, shock, and finally something that looked disturbingly like disgust, though it was quickly masked by a tight, frozen smile. "Mum, this is Margaret," Derek had said, his hand warm on the small of Margaret's back. "Maggie, my mother, Patricia." "Hello, Mrs. Thompson." Margaret had extended her hand. "Thank you so much for having me." Patricia's handshake was brief and cold. "Of course. Please come in." The house smelled like roasting chicken and fresh bread, warm and inviting, but the atmosphere was anything but. As they entered the living room, where the rest of the family had gathered, Margaret felt the temperature drop. Conversation stopped. All eyes turned to her. Derek's sister Rachel, a polished woman in her early 30s, with her mother's sharp features, actually let her mouth fall open before recovering. Connor, Derek's younger brother, exchanged a loaded glance with his father, Robert, who'd stood up from his recliner with an expression of poorly concealed shock. Everyone, Derek said, pride and affection warming his voice, in a way that made Margaret's heart ache. This is Margaret. Maggie, this is my family. What followed was the longest, most excruciating 4 hours of Margaret's life. The dinner itself was a masterclass in passive-aggressive hostility, disguised as polite conversation. Margaret sat at the long dining room table, Derek on one side, his Aunt Linda on the other, and felt herself shrinking with each passing minute. "So, Margaret," Patricia had said, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she passed the green beans. "Derek mentioned you work at a dental office. How nice. Have you been in that position long?" The emphasis on that position made it clear what Patricia thought of Margaret's career. 15 years, Margaret had answered, keeping her voice steady. "I'm the office manager. I handle everything from scheduling to insurance processing to staff management." "Oh, management," Rachel had chimed in, exchanging a look with her mother. "That must be fulfilling. At your age, I mean. Having found your niche." At your age. The words hung in the air like smoke. Derek had reached under the table and squeezed Margaret's hand, but he'd said nothing. That silence, that first, small betrayal, would echo in Margaret's memory for months to come. The questions had continued, each one sharpened with barely concealed contempt. Where did she grow up? Nowhere impressive. Where did she go to college? Community college. Then night classes for her business degree. Was she married before? Divorced, and wasn't that interesting? Any children? No. And the silence that followed that admission felt like judgment solidified into form. Aunt Linda, a thin woman with silver hair and cold eyes, had been the most direct. "I have to say, Derek, this is quite a surprise." She turned to Margaret with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "No offense, dear, but you're closer to Patricia's age than Derek's, aren't you?" The table had gone silent. Even the clink of silverware stopped. Margaret had felt her face burn. But before she could respond, Derek had finally spoken up. "Aunt Linda, that's inappropriate." "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking, sweetheart." Linda had patted Derek's hand like he was a confused child. "We're all just concerned. About both of you, really. This kind of relationship. It raises questions." "What kind of questions?" Derek's voice had an edge to it now, defensive. Robert had cleared his throat. "Son, your aunt has a point. We're not trying to be unkind. But this is unusual. You have to admit that. Unusual." Derek had looked around the table, his face flushed. "I'm dating someone I care about, someone who makes me happy. Why is that unusual?" "Because she's old enough to be your mother," Connor had said bluntly, dropping his fork with a clatter. "Come on, Derek. This is weird, and you know it." Margaret had felt something crack inside her chest. She'd set down her napkin carefully, fighting the urge to run. "I think," she'd said quietly, "perhaps I should go." "No." Derek had grabbed her hand. "No. You're not going anywhere. They're being rude, and I won't tolerate it." But even as he'd defended her, Margaret had noticed he hadn't contradicted them. Hadn't said they were wrong. Hadn't said age didn't matter. That love was love. That she was worth fighting for. He'd just said they were being rude. The evening had ended shortly after, with strained goodbyes and false promises to do it again soon. In the car on the way back to Oakley, Derek had apologized profusely. "They were horrible to you. I'm so sorry, Maggie. I don't know what got into them." Margaret had stared out the window at the passing subdivisions, each house lit from within, warm and golden, and impossibly far away from where she sat in the cold darkness of the car. "They hate me," she'd said simply. "They don't hate you. They need time to adjust." This caught them off guard. Our relationship caught them off guard, you mean? The fact that you're dating someone their age. Derek had been quiet for a long moment. "They'll come around. I know they will." But they didn't. Over the following months, as fall turned to winter and the Ohio cold settled into the city's bones, the Thompson family's campaign against Margaret intensified. It started with text messages that Derek would try to hide. His mother asking if he was still seeing that woman. His sister sending articles about age gap relationships and the psychological issues they supposedly indicated. Then came the accidental exclusions, a family birthday party that Derek was invited to, but Margaret wasn't. Thanksgiving plans that somehow didn't include her. Christmas celebrations she was told about after they'd already happened. They said it was just immediate family. Derek would explain, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "I fought with them about it, Maggie. I told them you should be there, but my mom said she wasn't ready, and I didn't want to make a scene during the holidays." Each excuse chipped away at Margaret's heart a little more. Not because the Thompson family rejected her. She'd half expected that from the moment she'd seen Patricia's face at the door, but because Derek let them. Because he chose their comfort over her dignity, again and again. The worst moment came in January, on a grey Tuesday, when freezing rain coated Cincinnati in ice, and the city ground to a shivering halt. Margaret had been home sick with the flu, feverish and aching, when her phone had buzzed with a message. It was from a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was local. The message contained a single photo. Derek and a young woman, blonde and beautiful, and probably in her late 20s, having lunch at Bakersfield, a trendy restaurant in Over the Rhine. They were laughing, leaning close, his hand on her arm. The text that followed read, "Thought you should know who he's with when he's not with you. Wake up, you're embarrassing yourself." Margaret had stared at that photo for 20 minutes, her hands shaking, her fever-fogged brain trying to make sense of what she was seeing. When she'd finally called Derek, her voice had been steady, despite the tears streaming down her face. "Who is she? Who is who? Maggie, are you okay? You sound terrible. The woman you were having lunch with today." "At Bakersfield. Who is she?" The pause that followed told her everything she needed to know. That was, "How did you—" "Maggie, it's not what you think." "Then what is it?" "Her name is Ashley. She's my cousin Rachel's best friend. Rachel set up the lunch. She said Ashley had some graphic design questions for her own business, and that I should meet with her as a favor." "And you didn't think to mention this to me?" Another pause. "I didn't want you to get upset. I knew how it would look." How it would look. Margaret had laughed, a bitter sound that hurt her raw throat. "Derek, someone sent me that photo. Someone from your family, I assume. They wanted me to see it. They wanted me to know that they're actively trying to replace me." "That's not— Maggie, you're sick. You're not thinking clearly. My family wouldn't— Your family has done nothing but try to destroy us since the day we met. That's not fair." The words had hung between them, like a chasm opening up, wide and unbridgeable. "You're right," Margaret had said quietly. "It's not fair. None of this is fair. But I'm not sure you actually care about that anymore." She'd hung up before he could respond. February brought no relief, only a deeper cold and the slow grinding realization that Margaret was fighting a war she couldn't win. Derek came to her townhouse 3 days after the Ashley incident, flowers in hand and apologies on his lips. He swore he'd talk to his family, set boundaries, make them understand that their behavior was unacceptable. "I love you," he'd said, pulling her into his arms in her small living room, while the radiator hissed and clicked in the corner. "I'm not giving up on us. I won't let them ruin this." Margaret had wanted to believe him. God, how she'd wanted to believe him. She'd buried her face in his chest and breathed in the familiar scent of his cologne and told herself that love could be enough, that he would choose her, that they would find a way. But belief and reality rarely align. The Sunday dinners continued, and Derek kept going without her. "I need to work on them," he'd explained. "If I bring you again too soon, it'll just make things worse. But I'm talking to them, Maggie. I'm making progress." What progress looked like, Margaret never saw. What she saw instead were the Instagram posts from Rachel's account, family gatherings, where Derek smiled broadly, arm around a brother, or laughing at something his father said, looking relaxed and happy in a way he never quite managed when defending their relationship. In March, Patricia called Margaret directly. The phone had rung on a Thursday evening while Margaret was making dinner, and she'd answered without checking the caller ID. "Margaret, this is Patricia Thompson." Margaret had frozen, wooden spoon still in her hand, tomato sauce simmering forgotten on the stove. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm calling because I think it's time we had an honest conversation, woman to woman." Patricia's voice was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made what came next more devastating. "I know my son cares about you. Derek has a good heart, too good sometimes. He wants to save people, fix things. It's one of his best qualities. But it also makes him vulnerable. I don't need saving," Margaret had said quietly. "Perhaps not, but you do need to be realistic. Derek is 39 years old. He wants children someday. He's always wanted to be a father. He wants a future, a real future, with someone who can give him that. You're 58, Margaret. You can't give him children. In 10 years you'll be nearly 70, and he'll still be in his 40s. Is that really fair to him?" The words had landed like physical blows. Margaret had gripped the counter, her knuckles white. "That's between Derek and me." "Is it? Because from where I'm sitting, you're being selfish. You're holding on to someone who deserves more. Someone who deserves a full life, because you're lonely. And I understand that. I do. But understanding doesn't make it right. Derek knows how old I am. He chose this relationship. He chose what he thought he wanted. But sometimes we don't know what's good for us. Sometimes we need the people who love us to protect us from our own mistakes." Patricia had paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was hard as stone. "I'm asking you, as his mother, to let him go. Walk away. Give him the chance to find someone appropriate, someone his own age, who can give him the life he deserves." "No." The word had come out strangled. "I won't do that." "Then you're even more selfish than I thought." The line had gone dead. Margaret had stood in her kitchen for a long time after that call, the tomato sauce burning on the stove, filling the townhouse with acrid smoke that made her eyes water. Or maybe it wasn't the smoke at all. When Derek came over later that night, She'd told him about the call. He'd been furious, pacing her small living room, running his hands through his hair, cursing under his breath. She had no right to call you, to say those things. I'm going to talk to her tomorrow. I'm going to make this stop. Will you? Margaret had asked quietly. She was sitting on the couch, exhausted, feeling every one of her 58 years. Or will you just tell her she was rude and then let it go? What's that supposed to mean? It means you've been saying you'll handle your family for 6 months, Derek. 6 months. And nothing has changed. If anything, it's gotten worse. These things take time. How much time? Margaret had stood up, facing him. How much more am I supposed to endure? How many more insults, exclusions, text messages, telling me I'm too old for you? How many more photos of you with younger women they're trying to set you up with? Those don't mean anything. I've told you. But you keep going to those lunches, those family dinners, those events where I'm not welcome. You keep choosing them. They're my family. The words had exploded out of him, raw and desperate. And in that moment, Margaret had understood, with perfect, heartbreaking clarity, that she would always come second. That blood would always trump love. Tradition would always trump choice. And his family's comfort would always trump her dignity. Yes, she'd said softly. They are. April brought the final betrayal, though Margaret didn't know it at the time. She'd been working late at the dental office, finishing up insurance paperwork, when Derek had texted, saying he'd be at his parents' house for dinner and would see her afterward. Nothing unusual. The Sunday dinners had expanded to occasional weeknight visits as well. What Margaret didn't know was that Patricia had organised an intervention. She found out 3 days later when Derek's brother Connor pocket-dialed her while talking to his wife. Margaret had almost sent it to voicemail, but something made her answer. Can't believe they actually did it. Connor's voice had come through, muffled but clear enough. Full-on intervention. Mum, Dad, Rachel, Aunt Linda, even brought in Father Mitchell from their church. What did they say? A woman's voice, Connor's wife. Everything, that he's throwing his life away, that Margaret is manipulating him, that he needs to end it before it's too late. Father Mitchell talked about God's plan for families, about appropriate partnerships. It was intense. What did Derek say? That's the thing. He barely defended her. He just sat there and took it. Kept saying he needed time to think. Mum said she'd found him an apartment near work, that he could move out of Margaret's place and get some space to clear his head. Margaret's hand had been shaking so badly, she nearly dropped the phone. Derek didn't live with her. He had his own apartment in Clifton. The implication was clear. His family thought he was too involved, too deep, and they wanted to physically separate him from her influence. Do you think he'll actually break up with her? Connor's wife had asked. I don't know, but if he doesn't, he'll lose the whole family. Mom made that pretty clear. Margaret had hung up quietly, her heart hammering in her chest. When Derek came over that night, she'd waited for him to tell her, waited for him to mention the intervention, to laugh about how ridiculous his family was being, to reassure her that nothing they said could change how he felt. He'd said nothing. Instead, he'd been distant, distracted. When she'd asked what was wrong, he'd claimed work stress. When she'd pressed, he'd gotten defensive. And when she'd finally asked directly if something had happened at his parents' house, he'd looked at her with guilt written across every feature and said, "Can we talk about this later? I'm really tired." That was when Margaret knew it was over. The confrontation came on a rainy Saturday in late April. Cincinnati was drowning in one of those spring storms that turned the Ohio River the color of churned mud and made the streets run with water. Margaret had asked Derek to come to her townhouse, had told him they needed to talk, really talk, about everything. He'd arrived looking haggard, shadows under his eyes, moving like a man carrying weight he couldn't bear. They'd sat in her living room, the same room where they'd laughed together, made plans together, built what she'd foolishly thought was a future together. And Margaret had laid out everything she knew, the intervention, the apartment his mother had found, the choice his family had given him, her or them. Derek had gone pale, his hands clenched in his lap. "How did you?" "Connor Pocket dialed me. I heard him talking to his wife about it." Margaret had kept her voice steady, though her heart was breaking into smaller and smaller pieces. "You weren't going to tell me, were you?" "I was. I needed time to process it all, to figure out what to say." "What is there to figure out, Derek? They gave you an ultimatum. Choose me and lose your family, or keep your family and lose me. That's not complicated." "It's not that simple." "Yes, it is." Margaret had leaned forward, needing him to see her, really see her. "It's exactly that simple, and the fact that you're still trying to figure out which choice to make tells me everything I need to know." "That's not fair, Maggie. You're asking me to cut off my entire family." "I'm not asking you to do anything. They're the ones asking you to choose. They're the ones who've spent 8 months making my life hell, insulting me, excluding me, trying to replace me. I'm just asking you to be honest about which side you're on." Derek had stood up, pacing to the window where rain streaked the glass like tears. "I love you. You know I do. But not enough." The silence that followed was answer enough. "They're my family," Derek had said finally, his voice breaking. "I can't just abandon them. My mother, my father, Rachel, Connor, they've been in my life since I was born. I know they've been awful to you, and I hate that. I really do. But I can't imagine my life without them in it. But you can imagine your life without me in it." He'd turned from the window, anguish written across his face. "Don't do that. Don't make this about not loving you enough." "Then what is it about, Derek? Because from where I'm standing, you've spent 8 months choosing them over me in 1,000 small ways, not defending me when they insult me, missing events with me to attend their events, hiding our relationship like something shameful, and now, when they finally forced you to make a clear choice, you're still hesitating. I need more time." "No." Margaret had stood up, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "No more time. I'm done waiting for you to decide if I'm worth fighting for. I'm done being the secret you're ashamed of. I'm done bleeding myself dry for a relationship where I'm always going to be second place. Maggie, please. Your mother called me in March. Did you know that?" Margaret had watched his face change, confirmation of his ignorance. "She asked me to leave you, told me I was being selfish, that I couldn't give you children, that I was robbing you of your future." And you want to know the worst part? Part of me wondered if she was right. She's not right. None of them are right. But you believe them just enough to not fight for us. You believe them just enough to hesitate when they make you choose. Margaret had felt tears finally breaking through, hot on her cheeks. "I deserve better than this, Derek. I deserve someone who doesn't have to be convinced that I'm worth defending. Someone who doesn't need time to decide if our relationship is worth the cost. Derek had crossed the room then, reaching for her. But Margaret had stepped back. Please don't make this harder than it already is. What are you saying? Margaret had taken a deep breath, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. I'm saying I'm done. We're done. I won't be the woman your family destroys because you're too afraid to stand up to them. I won't spend the rest of my life wondering when the next insult will come, the next exclusion, the next attempt to replace me. I won't watch you choose them over and over while telling me you love me. You're breaking up with me because of them. You're letting them win. No, I'm breaking up with you because of you. Because when it mattered most, you couldn't choose me. And I finally realized that I can choose myself. The rain had pounded against the windows, filling the silence between them. Derek had looked at her with devastation in his eyes, and for a moment, Margaret had almost wavered, almost taken it back, almost settled for the scraps of love he was able to give her. But then she remembered Patricia's voice on the phone, Rachel's mocking smile at that first dinner, the photos of Derek with other women, the Sunday dinners he attended without her, the intervention he'd never mentioned. All the ways she'd been made to feel small, unwanted, wrong for the crime of being older and falling in love. I think you should go, Margaret had said quietly. Derek had stood there for a long moment, looking like he wanted to argue, to fight, to finally show the backbone she'd been desperately hoping to see. But in the end, he just nodded, grabbed his jacket, and walked out of her townhouse and out of her life. The door had closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like an ending. The weeks after the breakup were the hardest of Margaret's life, harder in some ways than her divorce, because at least that had been a slow fade, a gradual realization that love had died. This was different. This was raw and sudden, and felt like something precious had been ripped away before it had a chance to fully bloom. May arrived with sunshine and flowers, the city coming alive with color and warmth, and Margaret felt like a ghost moving through it all. She went to work, smiled at patients, managed schedules and staff, and went home to her empty townhouse where Derek's absence echoed in every room. Her book club noticed something was wrong. On a Thursday evening in late May, sitting in Martha Chen's living room in Mount Lookout, sipping wine and supposedly discussing the latest thriller they'd all read, Martha had put down her book and looked at Margaret directly. Okay, that's it. What's going on? You've barely said a word in 3 weeks. Margaret had opened her mouth to deflect, to lie, to say everything was fine. But instead, she'd started crying. Ugly, heaving sobs that shook her whole body and made mascara run down her face in dark rivers. And then she'd told them everything. The story poured out of her. Meeting Derek, falling in love, the horrible first dinner with his family, the months of insults and exclusions and manipulations, the intervention, the choice, the breakup. She'd held nothing back. All the pain and humiliation and anger she'd been carrying, finally released in Martha's flower-scented living room, while 4 women who'd known her for years listened with expressions ranging from shock to fury. When she'd finished, drained and shaking, Diane Porter, a retired lawyer with silver hair and a spine of steel, had leaned forward and taken Margaret's hand. I'm gonna say something, and I need you to hear it, really hear it. Diane's voice was gentle but firm. You did the right thing. It doesn't feel right. It feels like I gave up. You didn't give up. You chose yourself. There's a difference. Diane had squeezed her hand. That man, Derek, he wasn't a bad person, but he was a weak one. And weakness in a partner is more dangerous than cruelty, because it's harder to recognize and harder to defend against. She's right, Martha had added. A cruel partner you can leave with a clear conscience, but a weak partner makes you question yourself. Makes you wonder if you're being unreasonable, if you're expecting too much, if maybe you should just accept less than you deserve. But I loved him, Margaret had whispered. I know you did, honey. This from Susan, the youngest of the group at 49, who'd been through her own painful divorce 2 years prior. But love isn't enough if it's not paired with respect, and he didn't respect you enough to defend you. His family certainly didn't respect you, and somewhere along the way, you stopped respecting yourself. That last part had hit Margaret like a slap, because it was true. She had stopped respecting herself, had accepted treatment she would never have tolerated in any other relationship, had made herself smaller and quieter and more convenient, had waited and hoped and settled for crumbs of the love she deserved. How do I fix that? She'd asked. The same way you fix anything, Diane had said. One day at a time, one choice at a time, starting with the choice you already made, to walk away from something that was hurting you. The conversation that night had been a turning point, not a magical cure. Margaret didn't wake up the next day suddenly healed and whole, but it was a beginning, a first step toward reclaiming the parts of herself she'd lost in trying to make Derek's family accept her. June brought small victories. Margaret started therapy with a counselor in Oakley who specialized in relationship trauma. Dr. Sarah Kim was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and an uncanny ability to ask exactly the right questions to make Margaret see patterns she'd been avoiding. Tell me about your marriage, Dr. Kim had said in their third session. What does that have to do with Derek? Humor me. So Margaret had talked about her ex-husband, about how he'd slowly withdrawn from the marriage, prioritizing work over their relationship, making her feel like an afterthought, about how she tried harder and harder to be enough, to be interesting enough, attractive enough, supportive enough to keep his attention, about how she'd lost herself in the trying. And with Derek, Dr. Kim had prompted. The parallel had hit Margaret like ice water. She'd done the same thing. Made herself smaller, more convenient, less demanding, trying desperately to be worth fighting for. The circumstances were different, but the pattern was identical. I've been doing this my whole life, Margaret had said slowly. Making myself smaller for people who should be making space for me. Yes, Dr. Kim had nodded. And now you have a chance to do something different, to choose differently. Choosing differently started with small things. Margaret stopped apologizing when she hadn't done anything wrong, stopped automatically saying yes to requests that didn't serve her, started saying no to the volunteer shifts at the food bank when she was tired, without feeling guilty about it. In July, she got a promotion at work, assistant practice manager, to full practice manager with a significant raise. The senior dentist, Dr. Richard Hayes, had called her into his office and told her she'd been the backbone of their operation for years, and it was time that was reflected in both her title and her paycheck. You've been holding this place together, he'd said, and I don't know what we'd do without you. I should have recognized that sooner. Margaret had gone home that day and looked at herself in the mirror. Really looked, for the first time in months. And instead of seeing the lines and grey hair and all the ways she didn't measure up to some impossible standard. She saw a woman who was skilled, valuable, strong enough to walk away from something that wasn't serving her. She saw someone worth fighting for. Derek tried to contact her 3 times. Once in June, a long text message saying he'd made a mistake, that he missed her, that he was sorry. Margaret had read it, felt the pull of old longing, and then deleted it without responding. The second time was in August. A voicemail left late at night when he was clearly drinking, rambling about how his family still wouldn't stop talking about age-appropriate women and how none of them made him feel the way she did. Margaret had listened to that message twice, then blocked his number. The third time was in September. A letter that arrived by mail. She'd almost thrown it away unopened, but curiosity had won out. In careful handwriting, Derek had written about how much he regretted not fighting for her, how he understood now what he'd lost, how he'd finally set boundaries with his family, and wanted a chance to prove he could be the man she deserved. Margaret had sat with that letter for a long time, reading and rereading it, part of her, the part that still remembered how safe his arms had felt, how genuine his smile had been in those early days. Wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that people could change, that love could win. But the stronger part of her, the part that had been slowly rebuilding over the past 5 months, knew better. Because even in the letter, Derek had framed everything around what he had lost, what he regretted. Not once did he truly acknowledge the pain he'd allowed her to endure. Not once did he show real understanding of how his weakness had enabled his family's cruelty. He was sorry he'd lost her, but he hadn't actually changed. Margaret had written a single response and mailed it back. I forgive you, but I don't want you in my life. Please respect that and move on. I have. October arrived with cool air and changing leaves, painting Cincinnati in shades of gold and crimson. Margaret was walking along the Little Miami Trail on a Sunday morning, enjoying the autumn beauty, when she ran into someone from her past. James Morgan, a man she'd known casually for years through the food bank. James was 62, a widower who'd lost his wife to cancer 3 years prior. They'd always had friendly conversations while sorting donations, but nothing more. That morning, though, they'd walked together, talking easily about everything and nothing. And when they'd reached the parking lot, he'd asked if she'd like to get coffee sometime. Margaret's first instinct had been to say no, to protect herself from the possibility of more pain. But then she'd looked at James. Really looked at him. Saw a kind man who'd also known loss and was brave enough to keep trying anyway. Saw someone age-appropriate, her mother's voice would have said. Except Margaret no longer gave that voice any power. She saw someone who might be worth taking a chance on. Coffee sounds nice, she'd said. They went to Highland Coffee House, the same place where Margaret had met Derek. But this time, there were no ghosts, no echoes of past pain. Just 2 adults talking honestly about their lives, their losses, their hopes. James didn't promise forever, didn't make grand declarations, didn't try to sweep her off her feet. He just listened when she talked about her work, asked thoughtful questions, shared his own stories about teaching high school history before retirement, and made her laugh with dry humor and terrible puns. At the end of their coffee, he'd walked her to her car and said, "I'd like to do this again." No pressure, no expectations, just spending time with someone whose company I enjoy. Margaret had smiled, a real smile, unforced and genuine. I'd like that too. as she'd driven home through the winding streets of Oakley, past houses settling into their foundations and trees growing thick and strong. Margaret had felt something unfamiliar. Peace. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but peace. The quiet certainty that she'd made the right choice, that she was worth more than being someone's shameful secret. That at 58, her life wasn't over. It was just beginning a different. She still thought about Derek sometimes, usually late at night when the townhouse was too quiet. Wondered if he'd found someone his family approved of. Wondered if he ever really understood what he'd lost. Wondered if his mother had ever had a moment of doubt about the role she'd played in destroying something that could have been beautiful. But those thoughts no longer had the power to break her, because Margaret had learned the hardest lesson of all, that you can't make people choose you. You can only choose yourself. And she had chosen her dignity over convenient love, chosen her self-respect over family approval, chosen the harder path of being alone rather than the soul-crushing path of being with someone who couldn't fully commit to defending her. It wasn't the ending she'd wanted when she'd met Derek in that coffee shop 18 months ago, but it was the ending she deserved. One where she walked away with her head high, her heart healing, and her future open to possibilities that included her, not despite her age, but because of everything she'd become. On a cold November evening, Margaret attended a book club meeting where they discussed a novel about second chances and redemption. When it was her turn to share, she'd said something that surprised even herself. I used to think second chances meant getting back what you'd lost. But I think real second chances are about becoming someone new. Someone stronger. Someone who knows their worth. Martha had raised her wine glass. To second chances then. And to Margaret, who's figured out what the rest of us are still learning. As the women around her raised their glasses, Margaret had felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness this time, but from gratitude, for the friends who'd held her through the worst of it, for the strength she'd found in herself, for the lesson learned and the woman she'd become. She was 58 years old. She'd been rejected, insulted, broken, and rebuilt, and she was finally, beautifully enough. Just as she was.